The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another ClearEdge 3D webinar. Today, we've got a lot of fantastic guests that are going to be talking about 18 new tips, hacks, and lessons learned for best practice Scan-to-BIM. It's been a little while since we've done one of these webinars, so I'm really looking forward to going through this again and taking a look. So, quick housekeeping. Participants are muted. Please ask any questions via the chat window for GoToWebinar. We'll pick those up at the end and get through as many as we can. We are recording this webinar, so once we have a chance to look at it and do any editing or tweaking, we'll get that sent out to anybody that registered and get you guys access to that as well. So that'll come hopefully in a week or two after. So with that, our agenda, I'll pop into presenter introductions in just a moment, and then we'll go through our 6 bidding and project management best practice tips. That's a mouthful. Our 6 field collection best practice tips and 6 data processing modeling best practice tips. So go through that key information. We've got a couple little bonus things at the end, some new technologies that we think are going to have a big impact on the workflow. And then Q&A at the end with whatever time we've got left. So with that, let's say hello to our presenters. Greg, if you want to say hi to everybody in just a second here. Greg Hale's joining us from Hale TiP. He's the CTO and co-founder. I've known Greg for a long time, since before he founded Hale TiP, and has always been a really good resource in the industry for Revit, for BIM in general, on the construction side, and been scanning a long time. So great to have him here. Say hello, Greg.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me on this afternoon. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. We've also got Ted Mort, who is the Vice President and Operations Manager at Eco3D. Also known Ted a long time, and Ted's a big part of the US IBD, which we'll talk about in a minute. Guest lecturer, and been around the scanning industry for a really long time. Done some really awesome work. Say hello, Ted.
Hey, thanks, Kelly. Excited to be here.
We also have Chris Nixon, principal and owner of Meridian 3D. Spent 10 years in the industry, so again, lots and lots of experience, lots of large-scale projects, and some good experience in the UK. So again, a wonderful additional viewpoint to have today. Say hello, Chris.
Hello, and I'm both excited to be here and feel very, very good about being included on this panel. So thank you for including me.
Good to have you, Chris. And last but certainly not least, we have Jesse here. Jesse is with VIATecnik, Technology Solutions Manager. We've had the pleasure of doing a lot of webinars with VIATecnik and the team over there in the past. They've been using our software a long time. Lots and lots of projects go through VIATecnik, so tons of experience as well. So Jesse, say hello, please.
How's it going, everyone? Thanks for hosting this, Kelly. Looking forward to this webinar.
It's a pleasure. And with that, I think we're just going to dive straight in. We've got 18 tips to get through and not a lot of time. So let's start out with number 1. Greg, you want to take it away?
All right, first tip. Let's take the first half hour on this one. We're going to go for level of accuracy, LOA, and the level of development specs. So I'm sure many of you have heard of the level of development specifications. A lot of people refer to that as well as level of detail, probably more commonly known as that. Level 200, level 300, 400. Really, the LOA serves as a complementary specification, very similar to that. And it's very well focused on the Scan-to-BIM industry. So there's really 2 main pieces of it where we're looking at the accuracy for the measurements as well as the accuracy for the representation of those elements. So basically think 3D models. So we tend to have a lot of conversations around project deliverables and what the expectations are going to be. this really helps you to plan for those expectations and to deliver those to a client in such a way that those expectations can be met. So as an example, you might be looking at a particular wall. You can define what level of accuracy in the measurements is going to happen based upon your field accuracies there. And then when you turn those into 3D models, what are those going to look like when you hand those over to a client? So it can really help level those expectations. So definitely look at a couple of those different resources there. I'd say it's relatively new in the industry, and it really provides a really good resource in your client handover.
And Ted, since you are on the leadership board for the US IBD, do you want to just really quickly describe what the US IBD is for everybody?
Absolutely. The US IBD was founded to give us leaders within the building documentation industry a forum to gather and discuss best practices, figure out different ways that we can be more accountable, and we can promote, the right way to do things and clear and concise communication within the industry. So we have a number of different subcommittees that have focuses from everything between BIM, 360 photography, and technology to standardization. So I'd encourage anybody on this call, take a look at the US IBD, get involved. You're obviously on this because you're interested in building documentation. So join a group of people and peers that also shares the same passion.
That's a great summation. And Ted, I know you're up for tip number 2, so I'll let you just keep rolling.
Awesome. So I can promise everybody here one thing, and that the best way to lose money, trust, and success is to communicate scope poorly. So what we've implemented is, in addition to taking an order for the work where we're talking about the location, area, LOD, we also ask why. And we're asking why so that we can better understand the intent of the client. That allows us to make better decisions when providing the service. So in a lot of cases, we're being asked for things that don't fully satisfy the intent of the final deliverable. So I encourage everyone to listen first, understand, and then confirm with the client.
Yeah,
And I would add,
go ahead, Jesse.
sorry about that. I would add that understanding the why is also really the end product, right, of what you're approaching. So whether you're trying to get a Scan-to-BIM that is actually for as-built purposes, or you're using it for coordination, or any other kind of purpose, depending on what you're intending to use a model, really drives the scope that you're trying to set forth early on in the project.
Yeah, well said. I was going to say something similar. It's, the end is not usually the part of the project where things go south. It's almost always the beginning. A lot of times you don't realize it to the end. And so I really like this because, from my own experience, this certainly speaks true. That's how you prevent projects from going bad. So let's go ahead and take a look at tip number 3 here. Greg, you want to pop back up?
Yeah, so I'm really having a lot of fun with 360 photos, really as a complement to what we're providing for building documentation. It really fits in nicely. It's a really quick, easy, cheap solution, but it's just really not well known. People just don't realize that the technology is out there. It's easily available. So as an example, we see an image up on the screen here of a Ricoh Theta camera. It's probably one of the most, if not the most popular brand in the industry as far as construction and design. Literally, you hold it above your head, you take a snapshot, and within a second, you have a photo synced over to your phone or smart device that you can then post to the web. And one of the really unique features of doing this is the fact that you can really reduce so much work in documentation of the site. Being a service provider for 3D laser scanning, we tend to have a very high-end deliverable, something that costs a lot of money, takes a reasonable amount of time, and in some cases produces a result with 3D imagery and mapping, which is very similar to simple photographs. So what this can do is you go out to the site, you basically link up the 360 camera with your phone, You also link up to a known plan that you have, or even a sketched plan of the site. And as you're taking those images, you're basically mapping directly onto that PDF. So how many times have you gone out to the site, taken pictures, and had to document that for somebody else and say, hey, I was standing in this room, this location, looking in this direction, and communicating that to somebody, whereas a 360 photo mapped while you're on the site can save hours and hours of time and also increase the level of communication that happens among the team. So regularly about $400 plus maybe an additional software service, kind of a monthly subscription. And you can really help communicate that. And we actually have this as a regular add-on service to all of our 3D laser scanning now. And it's a very rare occasion that someone doesn't take hold of it for, you know, even just a couple $100 to get some extra photos on the site. And it really helps our own internal team look at these projects in an easier fashion as well from any smart device.
Well, and I really love that relative to specifically bidding a project, you know, before you've even got the job, this is just such a fantastic way to capture the conditions so that you can put together a better bid, so that you have imagery that you can share with the client for challenging areas or things that are going to require extra work, and just help the team understand it, and actually building up a good scan plan that really accounts for not just the floor plan of the building, but actually the entire space that you're having to operate in. So it's a fantastic tip.
And Kelly, I would love to add, from a modeling standpoint, it's very effective, especially when receiving scans that are black and white. We use this internally to kind of help understand change in materials and everything without having to go back and add that additional RGB scan to those scans.
That's a great point. Yeah, so Chris, can you pop on here so we can talk a little bit about tip number 4 here? It's all about the metrics.
I will. Yes, thank you. One of the things I've been focusing on, particularly in the last couple of years, as our standalone business has developed, is some of these bidding and proposals and how we're sort of translating that to longer term clients and, you know, at this point, multi-year projects. But to boil that down into some points for you guys, is working with how to ask the right questions and what things to really focus on as you're facing these proposals with either new clients or follow-on projects with your clients as you go through. And one of the biggest changes for us that we're having the most success with is something that was counterintuitive and actually took a lot of training to get to for us, but to begin discussing the client's budget much earlier in the process. It can be kind of uncomfortable. It becomes a thing you don't want to talk about because we all love to get really caught up in the technical details and the deliverables. And all of that can be not exactly a waste of time, but it can be unproductive if the client has a number in their head that is not actually matching what the reality of the cost is going to be down the road. So what we try to do, and I would suggest everybody else, is to get the budget discussion earlier in the project proposal, so that you at least have a feel, even if that's a range of what the client's expectations for spend is going to be, before you spend hours and weeks and site walks and many times flying out somewhere to even look at a site. And it can save you a lot beforehand. And then moving on here, the second point being how important is that firm's experience. You know, there's a lot of new competition in the market today, which is great because it's really driving the industry and giving engineers and architects and owners and operators a lot more choice and exposure. But is the company that's doing the selection going to focus on firm experience? And do they know about accuracy? And is that important to them, or should it be?
Well, and one of the things I really kind of loved about the conversation we had about this before was, a lot of times there's a fair amount of education going on when we're trying to provide these services to clients, because a lot of times they don't understand the technical detail. And so it was a really interesting point that you really have to understand how much they understand and focus on things that aren't necessarily technical in those conversations to really get to the technical answers that you need to price and bid a job. And of course, I loved your last one. Beware of give me your best price clients. Yeah, that's definitely a challenge.
And I would just, my concern there, and I would just throw this out there, and you can look into it more, is you have to spend a lot of time and thought on when your proposals and your efforts to try to win a job turn into free consulting, as opposed to actually trying to win that project. So if the client's only concerned about money, that may work to your advantage, and it may also really work to your disadvantage. You just want to try to find that out earlier in the process before you do a lot of free consulting.
Definitely. All right, Ted, I think you're up again.
All right. Well, access in and around a site can be challenging at times, and getting off on the wrong foot can definitely cost you precious time in the field. You can improve your odds of executing a smooth project by communicating with the site team that they are your first priority and that you're going to yield to them. You're there to support and make their project better in one capacity or another. This works everywhere from construction sites to hospitals to high purity manufacturing environments. I think that when you walk in with all this equipment, initially you're going to be a distraction. So it can help to communicate what it is you're about to do. Sometimes there's a safety meeting in the morning. It can help to have a place to just have a quick 5-minute conversation about what's about to happen, prevent distraction occurring during the day for the team out there. The other thing that we do is we try to develop a very good rapport with the person who's going to be providing access. We call them the gatekeeper. This is more likely to affect you if you're walking into an active environment. Again, hospitals, active office, anything that is a functioning facility is typically going to have a facility management or a security guard that's going to be assigned to allow you access. You would be blown away at how far a cup of coffee in the morning goes for you when you show up to meet that person. So, number one suggestion, let everybody know that you're there to support them. Number two, find that person that's going to be critical to providing you access to all the spaces and make them your best friend on day one.
Excellent points. I got to cheat a little bit because I worked inside a larger company, so I had the relationships ahead of time for most of my projects, but few we did externally. That was always a critical one for us. All right, and Chris, and actually Jesse may have a comment or two here. We can't really go through every bullet point, but I love this because it was almost like a little pre-bid checklist of things to make sure you ask in your owner conversation. Is there any one point you want to talk about, Chris?
Well, I do think the first one is very important in that we can, as technical people, we can really get obsessed with going through all the technical information and how great it's going to be, and really kind of blow some folks away, particularly people that are very interested in it, like engineers and architects who have been seeing it in the press but never actually had their hands on it before. And you can spend a lot of time and effort in that and that not actually be the decision person. They may be an influencer, but they may be somebody who has a lot of input into who's going to be chosen, but we found a lot more success when we began asking questions and really finding out who it was that was going to be making that final decision. And I won't go into a lot of details, but I have had experiences in the past where I won the technical nod and I won the commercial nod, and then the owner operator of the plant turns around or facility turns around and gives it to their friend who was right down the street. So it can be really in your interest to try to get in, and it's not necessarily a direct question, but to find out who's actually going to be making this decision.
Yeah, it's a great point. And Jesse and Greg actually both mentioned at some point ad services and kind of adding on to stuff. So Jesse, do you want to say anything about number 5, or Greg?
Yeah, I think number 5 and number 3 are pretty important in terms of understanding what your main use of that end product would be, right? And don't think that a single Scan-to-BIM model can answer all your questions, and the value added can be applied to other cases. For example, I would say a lot of architects come to us with a Scan-to-BIM project, but they are intending for it to be used alongside their designs. And oftentimes with those types of projects, you're looking into more orthogonal layouts of the walls, and they're willing to kind of sacrifice accuracy as a result of usability. But for general contractors, that may be the complete opposite. They're more interested in the accuracy, and they're not so much interested in how easy it is to manipulate that model, because they're just more concerned about how maybe a tenant fit out can be applied to those existing conditions. So really understanding who the final user of that product is will really drive how you proceed with at least the modeling portion of the project, and what an architect may use that model for may not necessarily be applicable to a general contractor or vice versa.
Yeah, excellent way to phrase it. And Greg, I know you and I've talked a lot about these deliverables can have a lot of different uses, and a lot of times very small amount of extra work can expand what somebody can do with it. You want to say anything about that real quick?
Yeah, you bet. This really just lays right on top of what the other two gentlemen are talking about, really understanding what the project goals are. Being a service provider, you kind of get to see a lot of different deliverables, and you say, well, what if, we just add this little thing on, we can start to add so much more value to what we're doing with a very little cost. So it does come from that, and asking a lot of those why questions really leads to those answers.
Awesome. Well, with that, we are going to pop on to our field collection best practices, and take a look at some of these tips. Greg, you're up first here. The multi-device spiel.
All right, yeah. So this is part of one of the really interesting parts of the industry. Very fast-moving, evolving, hard to keep up with. It really kind of plays on a difference with seeing lots of different projects and different ways to approach them. So you've certainly seen a large emergence of drones and cheaper scanners, more service providers, different devices. So being able to see that, we were just touching on it, touching on all the whys, really gets you to leading to some additional solutions. So creating a plan for the multiple device usage. So in a lot of cases, I'll use a drone as an example. They're perfect for capturing data on a roof that may otherwise be a little bit more dangerous with a scanner. Might be accessible, but certainly could be used and is certainly applicable. So maybe mixing a couple things there. Collection device technology has never been better. We're always seeing things evolve out here. One of the things I love is the mobile scanning. A great example I have is occupied buildings, especially things like apartments or classrooms. They're actually occupied, and people want you to scan or document while they're being occupied. So your main goal in a lot of those cases is to get in and out as fast as possible. So some devices won't be able to get you there, so you might have to alter your plan to do that. So lots of options. It takes a lot of expertise in diving into things. So one particular piece of equipment may not solve every problem. So having lots of different wrenches and screwdrivers and all sorts of different tools in your bag, ready to handle different situations. So definitely keep looking into things and don't think that one solution is going to solve them all. There might even be better, more appropriate solutions.
Yeah. Well, and I think the key point is to plan for it, because every one of these solutions has slightly different outputs, slightly different restrictions and limitations, accuracy profiles. So it's really, really important to align that plan with your kind of deliverables, with the expectations that we talked about before. That's a fantastic tip. Jesse, tell us a little bit about access restrictions.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this tip overlaps with Greg's previous tip about understanding your restrictions. One of the big things before really going onto the site is really doing your homework about the site. As Greg mentioned, there may be limitations on when you can get accessibility onto the site, and really understanding what's critical in terms of your scan. You don't want to just distribute your scans evenly throughout a space if, say, a particular section of the site is much denser than the rest of the site. And really planning out where you're specifically scanning will save you a lot of time when it comes to actually being on the site and all of the activities going on. Also understanding if anything needs to be prepped on site before you actually go on the site the day of the scan. If there's a lot of items on the site that may be in the way, if certain surfaces needs to be covered up because they're highly reflective, or there's just way too much sunlight going on or not enough light, it's really understanding what you need to get yourself a optimal scan. And then the last thing is really, it kind of touches base on the previous tip, which is kind of talking to the site managers, getting a preliminary site walk. Don't expect you to be on the site just once on one day and have it be a done deal. Oftentimes it may be multiple instances. So in this instance of these two images, it's actually one of the projects that we worked on in New York, the Hudson Yards project, which was involved the scanning of all of the rail lines and all of the tracks while it was still operating on a daily basis. So understanding when is the best time to get in and avoiding those trains so you don't get run over is definitely key here. So it's definitely applicable to other projects as well.
Oh, and that was a complex project, I know. So it's a great example. Greg, you want to talk to us about that ancient technology called targets?
I love it. Yes. So beware the salesman should be the other caption on the slide. So certainly a lot more people coming into the idea of scanning. A lot more scanners being sold out there. Some people who don't necessarily have the same kinds of backgrounds. So what I've seen a lot of lately is just to basically get people's foot in the door, to get them to buy the scanner, basically overselling it and saying that you really don't need targets to provide a good, complete professional service on it. And so I've seen too many people caught in that trap. So they go through, they get a budget approval for a new scanner, they get it going, they start scanning with it, and they just start to find all sorts of situations that don't quite work in a targetless workflow. So some areas where targets really help. So just think of a big, wide open field, maybe a little bit of tall grass, and there's really no features out there to help you tie scan to scan, which is essentially the use of cloud-to-cloud registration. So you need some kind of planar objects to reference when doing those. Even outdoor scans, even if sometimes you do have good geometry, windy days, you've got grass blowing, you've got trees blowing around, that geometry is being used as part of that cloud-to-cloud registration. So that can screw things up. So I know we don't typically go on heavily windy days, but occasionally the wind blows and it can screw with your registration a little bit. Anybody who's ever done above ceiling scanning knows that it's hard to get good overlap between scans. So sometimes it's easier to simplify that and just get some targeted registration as part of that. Certainly targetless is a part of that process, but you still need some kinds of targets in there to step through that. And then just another basic example, think of an L-shaped corridor. In a targetless registration, you might have to go 3-4 scans, and one that has targets, you might be able to set targets in between, and you still don't have a ton of overlap, but you have enough to get targets in between scans into the corner of a hallway. And then when to use targetless, the areas that works really well. I mentioned lots of planar objects. We use the term dead end rooms. So a lot of times we'll go through targeted registration. Through main corridors, we can tie it in. We can easily tie it into survey control. And then maybe 4, 5, 6 rooms kind of branching off of that can easily be done with a cloud-to-cloud registration. And we actually use them complementary to each other. But when we go through it, we plan on it, we make field notes. We understand that scanning is going to be a little bit different, trying to capture overlap instead of targets. So we do it within the plan to make sure that we're scanning appropriately when we do that. And then there's some other areas where spheres are just prohibitive. We've done a couple of airport scans, and people feel really weird about these little white balls laying around all over the place and start talking to security guards. So in those cases, cloud to cloud works fantastic. In some cases, construction sites, some construction workers are worse than kids, and they pick up the balls and they kick them around. So we see all sorts of situations, and targetless can be fantastic in those situations.
Yeah, that's a great breakdown. Ted, talk a little bit about safety when you're actually out in the field collecting the work. It's not just about having a plan in place and where you scan.
Yeah, it gets a little deeper than that. And, unfortunately, the reality is that damage is going to happen. And you try to do your best to prepare for it, but damaged equipment has a dramatic impact on, the profitability of your company if you're a service provider. It can impact an active construction site if you're a contractor self-performing. You can prevent the QA from occurring. So, we try to reduce that exposure by promoting the people and the equipment equally in our safety training. In my experience, damage happens when gear is left unattended, and that's so easy to prevent. So we always try to stay within arm's length of that equipment when it's out and set up. That is just a good best practice for everyone to use. We also reduce our odds of having damage happen by choosing support gear that has redundant fail-safes and it exceeds the minimum needs for your equipment. There's a tendency right now to go out and use camera equipment to hold up scanners, and the reality of those carbon fiber legs is that they do like to give out when you put a couple pounds on them. Not used to that kind of weight. So you can find options out there that are spec'd for weights and uses that are greater than what yours is. Highly recommended. It's worth every dollar there to prevent that damage from occurring.
Yeah, one of the tips I remember you mentioning in another presentation is even having like tethers and leashes for your target, so that if you had a magnetic target and it fell off, it wouldn't fall and hurt somebody or get damaged, which I never thought of. I just loved that example. So very important. Keep that in mind. Greg, number 11, to continue down the safety theme.
Yeah, just a couple more things to add on to the safety list here. So train the team. Again, I've seen a lot more people kind of coming into the industry that aren't necessarily used to the safety standards. So at the get them OSHA trained, get them a 10-hour certification. Contracting firms are used to more to like the 30 or 40-hour safety training, but there's a lot of exposures on project sites that can really provide dangerous situations for your employees as well as others. So it really helps to invest in that and understand you are on construction sites in a lot of cases. So the right safety gear, I think everybody will agree, a high-vis vest is your probably number one best investment. As soon as you put that on and a hard hat, maybe safety glasses, you can basically walk the world and nobody will ask you. If you ask you what you're doing, I'm surveying the building. And everything gets dropped. When you start to say, hey, we're filming a movie or we're doing something different or we're doing an MRI in the building, things get a little weird. So that little that jacket makes you look like a surveyor or you know, a professional in the business, and it kind of helps remove some of those questions and keep things rolling. Not to mention, it can help you get hit from getting hit by a forklift in some cases. So it can also provide some good safety measures as well. And then as far as your planning goes, it kind of gets overlooked quite often is some of the hazard zones. I just got a picture there of a recent project we had where it was pretty difficult access up into, or I should say onto the roof, across a couple scaffolds, old church. So potentially some unsafe conditions, as well as making sure you can get your equipment up there. So having some idea of your different access points, your plan on where you're going to get to, and then if there's any other safety restrictions on that site is also going to impact your process. So keep those things in mind. Google Earth is probably your best friend in those cases.
Well, and you know, going back to your tip about multiple devices, you know, one of the things we were so excited about in my former life with UAVs was just the impact that having a flying camera had on safety, and not having to get the architect and the owner and a bunch of people up on a, you know, on a man lift to go inspect something on the roof line. You could just get the drone up there and share the screen. So lots of different ways to make sure that you're thinking about safety as you're getting out there in the field. Ted, I feel like we're bouncing back and forth ping pong between Ted and Greg right now. Ted, how about you tell us a little bit about the knowledge gap?
All right, I'm going to spike on Greg right now. So the knowledge gap is a real deal that happens when you start to grow and you develop teams that specialize in different elements of the reality capture. So as we experience this growth, we could no longer have that same person scan and then come in and model. So we learned a hard lesson that it's not easy to read minds, and we developed a couple processes that were successful in standardizing note-taking. In fact, we've gone as far as to do that all through tablets now, so that we're promoting clarity in the notes. And we're also putting in effort to provide visibility to the site from the perspective of the office by rolling out these 360 photos and cameras. And it's a few $100s, and you can get out there and bring that person in the office out to the site with the technician. I mean, that photo is worth 1,000 words.
That's fantastic. So let's move on to our last set of tips here. Just data processing, modeling best practices. Greg, you've got a chance to serve and start the next point here. You know, just in terms of processing targetless data.
All right, Ted, look out. I got a mean serve. Might want to put your safety glasses on. So process targetless data. So with this, kind of mentioned before some of those dead ends, so I don't want to tag onto that too much there, but keep that within the plan. Understand that that's going to be kind of your branch off of your main, either your survey points, or maybe you're tied into your corridor and your targets. So keep that in mind. Targetless is fantastic for above ceiling spaces. Probably no space is harder to get those targets in and keep that process going than in ceiling spaces. So as soon as targetless came out, it provided a fantastic process to help us through those situations. Cluster those targetless scans. Again, that kind of comes down to your plan. So once we get up above a certain level, we understand that we're going to use targetless registration, and we kind of branch those off into our registration process with all of our notes. The scan acquisition maps, you can see an example there. We've basically created a legend. So as we go along the floor plan, we can identify per different elevations. You know, this one might be on the ground, this one might be above a desk, this one might be right into the ceiling space, like at the ceiling level, and then whatever's above. And occasionally in the very large ceiling spaces, we might have some additional notes in there for higher above ceiling scans. And this really also helps not only us in processing the data and then creating 3D models from it, but when we do a handover to the client, they can reference go back to a simple PDF with even potentially a link to the 360 picture exactly where that scan is at. So they don't necessarily have to open up all of that great scan data, they can actually just click on that, jump into a 360 photo, and get an idea of those spaces. So
fantastic.
Use those targets and target list registration.
Yeah. All righty. And Ted and Jesse, a little bit about registration QA.
Okay,
Jesse, if you don't mind, I'll kick off with the spot checks and then let you wrap this one.
Go for it.
All right. So I encourage everyone to check throughout the registration process. Don't wait to the end. On large projects, we do spot checks at milestones to ensure that we're not chasing those errors when we're trying to close the thing out. You should also trust but verify. All right. So what we mean by that is that the software may suggest that the registration is good, but nothing can get by a quick visual inspection of a couple cross sections through the whole project. So those are two things to implement during that registration process to have a more predictable outcome.
Yeah, so definitely to add on to Ted's point, early on reviewing the scans yourself is really critical, and it helps you kind of prevent additional rework in the long run. One of the things that we love to do early on when we get the scans is, as Ted mentioned, do cross sections. So, for example, cutting the floor plan such that you can only see the walls and the outlines of the walls. You can quickly tell where scans are off because there'll be exact overlaps of outlines of walls. And you can also see that in sections when you take a look at walls. And countless times we find this early on before we even start modeling. And it definitely saves us a lot of headache that would have been caused if we didn't do that quick spot check early on.
Yeah, and this is, where I'd say a lot of projects go wrong is actually in the registration, particularly when you're first getting into scanning. If you're new to it, this is the most likely place to make a mistake technically, and it's one of the hardest ones to learn how to kind of control and track down and fix. So really important point, particularly with a lot of new people getting into scanning with some of the lower cost devices that are out there. It's actually, we see this a fair amount with our software, because sometimes people will call us and they don't understand why our software can't extract a pipe or a duct or something, and we get the scan data and there's 3 pipes and they're all slightly overlapping, and that's we can extract 3 pipes, but we're not just getting 1. So it's definitely registration's important. And so, shameless product plug alert. From the modeling standpoint, once you kind of get the models that you've generated from the point cloud, some of that can be automated, but a lot of that is a manual kind of tracing process. And there's also the risk of missing things. And so, we came out with Verity, last year, and it's primarily focused on construction verification, but we've actually got a lot of traction with people using it to check and validate that their models that they're having to manually generate from in Revit or any other software, that they're actually getting those things modeled correctly to specification, and making sure they're not missing anything. So, a bit of a tip there. Chris, you're up again. Don't overmodel. This is probably my favorite tip of the whole lot, because, gosh, it's just so easy to do.
It is, and we do a lot of in-house modeling, but we also use a lot of subcontract modeling, and that has been something that we've had to really work on over the years, is to watch for not just achieving models that are under scope, watching out for those, but watch for model, and that would be my suggestion, watch for models that you've produced more than was in the agreed scope, because you can very quickly find yourself arguing over things like not being able to see all the handrails, and handrails weren't even actually in the scope to produce. So just keep on task and on scope, and when you're doing your QA, make sure that you're not providing things to the client that were out of scope, over modeled, because that will, it also sets the expectation. They'll love the model, but they're also getting a lot of things for free that they may not have been expecting. And
yeah,
the second point there.
I think my favorite example is I remember handing over a project to a client where we had somebody had modeled the handrails in one part of the building, and it was totally not in the scope or the requirement, but we got a phone call and they were upset because we'd only modeled half of the handrails.
It's a great example. We've seen it too, where, you know, we would put in one part of the model, we'd put in what we needed to, which was all of the top rails, and then in another part of the model, they had gone through and modeled, you know, all of the individual monorails as well, and so then that became an issue.
Yeah.
Why is it in this part of the model, not the other? So you just got to really watch for nailing the model scope, both over and under.
Well, and I love the second part of this, doing little mock-ups. Mock-ups is such an important part of the construction process, but also it's a great tool for modeling just to help people understand what the expectation is. So I thought that was a great point.
And I would say I would give anybody the suggestion. I have disguised that as we need to verify what software you're using. So send them an example model verifying that they can open their software, and then you can lead that discussion to, all right, this is the model level that we're going to be providing you. That's tying right back into tip number 1. And that gives them a chance to comment on that model level way before you get into final deliverables. That's
a great add-on. Jesse, Ted, check and recheck model accuracy.
Yeah, I'll start this one and then I'll hand it over to Ted. So one of the approaches that we often do in terms of QC is having a logic to our QC. So what many times what I often see newer people jumping into the QC process do is they just dive right in and look at elements at random and see if they're aligned. But really, if you do a QC approach that is much more methodical, it'll ensure that you're covering all your bases and you're ensuring that you're checking everything. So one of the things that I like to do is do a slight section of the floor plan at the very bottom and look from maybe plan east all the way to the west and see if there's anything wrong with it, and catch all of those issues and proceed to move on and move the sliver up another several feet and do the same process over and over again. Same thing for cross sections, so that you can catch whether or not maybe a floor deflection matches the scans throughout the entire space. And you won't necessarily know that unless you're able to methodically approach it in a logical way.
So Jesse is talking about some of those visual inspections, cutting the cross sections, moving it around, which is fantastic. I have an option for making that even more effective, and it's something that we've been doing for a while and really promoting. We've been using an open source sort of free tool to create an automated QA process. Now, this works, but it requires a lot of effort to build and maintain. Ultimately, what we're doing is we're colorizing deviation between the cloud and the model. So if I have a Scan-to-BIM product, that model, I can put in that source cloud, run this analysis, and see where the deviation occurs to make sure that omissions are acceptable and that everything's within tolerance of the accuracy that we're stipulating. Now, the trouble with that is, like I had mentioned, it's free software, but it takes a lot of effort. So are you ready to suffer the opportunity cost that is building that? And what we're really excited about is some of these new developments that we're seeing in Verity to potentially automate that process of comparative analysis between that product and the source scan.
Right, and I think Ted, you put on a good point. There are costs and challenges with like both approaches, right? What we found the best is kind of the best of both worlds, finding and picking, choosing and picking your battles. What is the best way of QCing? So it's not a single solution, but if you kind of mix it between the two, you kind of get where you need to go.
Yeah, yeah, and you know that's this is one of those areas where it's hard when you've got tens of thousands of things to model, you know, to make sure that you've got them all modeled correctly. And just for the same reason, spot checking is kind of a risky thing in the construction industry, but it's something people have had to do. And kind of the same thing is true for Scan-to-BIM. It's just, you know, nobody can check all 10,000 elements manually, and so it's definitely an area where we can leverage technology now in a way we couldn't before. And our last tip here, let's take a look at involving the client in QA/QC.
Yes. So one of the things that we do is provide in-progress models. But oftentimes the challenge of providing in-progress models to the client is not knowing what is complete. Oftentimes when you're actively approaching a model, you may still be adjusting things. You still may be taking a look at a particular element. So really understanding where in the process you're at and making sure the client also understands that. So that may be one of the things that we do is building that data within the models themselves. So in one particular project, we built in metadata as to what is complete, what is still in progress, and what was successfully reviewed. And that way we're able to communicate that over the client, and they can accept the deliverables more easily, and they know what to check. And we can kind of see in a overarching view as well, like the progress of that conversion, how far we are in terms of converting from a scan to BIM.
Yeah, that's an absolutely great suggestion. That's, you know, one of these interesting things I've seen, you know, in all from all of you, I think, in some of the different tips is involving the client in the process more, whether it's getting them involved in QA/QC, getting them involved in checking the models early, getting them involved just different ways, because it helps create that tight connection with the client that really helps win additional projects, additional work. So fantastic stuff. With that, I think we are going to head on into a couple of quick things here, and I'm just going to go through these so we can get to Q&A pretty quickly. You know, one of the things that came up in our conversations was, you know, that this is constantly evolving and changing. There's new hardware all the time, new capabilities, and this happens, you know, on practically a monthly basis right now in the industry. So one of the trends we've seen a lot is on-the-fly registration, whether it's mobile scanners or scanners that are using cameras to track their location as you move them around. Yeah, it still has some of the weaknesses Greg mentioned for, you know, targetless registration, but it is getting better. So it's interesting to see, you know, how that can impact the collection process, you know, when it works. Better photogrammetry software. You know, this is something that I still think is kind of not quite ready for broad interior capture at a high level of accuracy. But, you know, to Greg's point, for 360 photographs, you can get a lot of value out of just 360 photos, and you can even take those into photogrammetry tools now. And if you don't need accuracy, you're really using it for visualization, that may get you what you need. So definitely another trend to keep an eye on. And then self-piloting drones. So this is, we could probably put self-piloting scanners too, because, you know, there's all sorts of stuff now about rover robots that have scanners mounted on them. This is one of those areas where, you know, there are actually services that provide this. Have any of our panelists used one of these services? that actually has a drone that flies itself? I'm going to take silence. Take silence as a no. And this is, I think, the challenge. Oh, yep.
Well, I'll just say that, and this is not being negative, we demoed some, and we had a couple that we gave it the flight plan and everything else and sent it off. And I don't know what happened, but it just kept going. So I would agree with your previous statement that they're working on it all the time. It's getting closer all the time. I have not seen that we're there yet, but I'm looking forward to today.
Yeah, amen. Set it and forget it, right? It's a great idea,
Right.
but we're a long way for it being practical indoors. I've seen some good case studies with it working outdoors, particularly for earthworks. But it'll get here one day, even indoors. And then the last is kind of the big trend right now with AR and VR headsets. And basically, you know, VR's come a long way in the last couple of years, and we're finally getting some OSHA-approved AR gear. And I'm so excited about this because, you know, we do all this wonderful digital stuff, and then we eventually still have to print to installation drawings for the job site for the foreman and the guys in the field. And this is the kind of thing that's eventually going to get rid of that kind of last mile of paper that we've got to do to build a building. So with that, let's dive into some Q&A here. So I'll try and queue up the questions here. We don't have a ton of time, but we'll get through a couple. So the first, I believe this is going to be for Greg and anybody else that wants to jump in. But with the 3D camera, which I'm guessing is the 360 camera, what software do you use to share with clients for markups?
So there's two that work pretty well, are pretty well accepted in the industry. We use HoloBuilder. The other one is Struction Site. It's like construction without the con in there. Both those are very good pieces of software, allow you to capture the stuff in the field, share it via the web, and also do some interesting markups and digital sharing and collaboration, basically through those 360 photos. So both really good pieces of software.
Awesome. And then another question about 360 photos. This is from Eric saying that we're already using 360 photos, but just for verification. Could you talk about some of the software and processes you use with the 360 cameras to map existing conditions?
Yeah, sure. So both of those softwares, again, both map those out. So as mentioned, while you're on site, you can take your floor plans, and essentially you're clicking on a place in the map where you're taking the picture. And the nice thing about the 360 photo, it doesn't have to be directional, so you don't have to tell it which direction you're going. So one shot in a room is honestly enough, and you can honestly walk a site with the camera overhead, and just as fast as you can walk the site, you can document it. The other great features of those are things like X-ray vision. So think of taking your weekly progress photo in each room, and then being able to go back and see what it was like before you put chipboard on or put your ceilings in. And that X-ray mode allows you to do basically a limited AR application where the camera, you point it at the wall, it sees what it sees through the camera. You can overlay your picture from a couple of weeks ago before they put drywall on. You can map those two together, and it'll basically show you what was there before that drywall went up. So fantastic applications, again, really cheap hardware, fairly cheap software, huge value. Kind of low-end tech, but great new applications coming from people being very creative with what they're using for. So HoloBuilder Instruction Site.
All right. Anybody else want to speak about stuff they're using with 360 cameras?
I'll just chime in that when we're using like fantastic modern laser scanners with integrated HDR, but it's still relatively slow in that when you're trying to do a project that's, 2,000 to 3,000 scans, and it really adds up when you have to do an HDR color process. So the scan takes 1.5 minutes, but the photos take 9.5 minutes if you do it internally. The great thing is you don't have a lot of post-processing afterwards. So we actually find it quicker to use some other 360 type cameras where we just pop the head off the scanner, stick the imager right on top, and then take an instantaneous one-shot photo. And the software now lets us just drop that straight into the registration and colorize the point. So there are options out there too that it doesn't have to be, you can do the photos exactly on the scan position. And if you get the offsets right, which is not easy, but you can even do it with the recode Theta S that he was showing.
Yeah.
And you can adapt that to just fit right on your scan position. So that's another process way that you can speed the whole thing up and just use one quick clip photo.
Yeah, and it's great point. It's something you can even do with the internal camera on the scanners. You can export those out as 360 photos and then load those into HoloBuilder or Struction Site. So lots of different ways you can take it. We had a question about the comment that I had made about the modeling what's left. So I kind of jumped ahead and talked a little bit about both applications on this slide, but EdgeWise, which is our software for generating models from point clouds, we added a new feature recently so that anything that you haven't generated a model from the point cloud data, those points get kind of broken out and you're able to export them out. So, if you've got all the piping and your walls and ductwork and things like that modeled, well, you can export out a point cloud of whatever's left. That way, when you go into Revit to kind of finish out the model, put in equipment, put in all this other stuff, you don't have all the point cloud data. You have just the point cloud data you have left to model. So that's what I was referencing there. And then one last question back to Greg, which is on this scan plan that we brought up. You have scanner A and scanner B. So the first part of the question is that two different scanners? And the second part of the question is what software are you using to build up your scan plans?
Oh, so for the scan plans, we simply use Bluebeam just to go ahead and create a few simple marks, and it has an automatic counting tool. So for the scanners on this particular job, we used 3 scanners in tandem with each other. Essentially, one person doing more of a traditional architectural scan for the floor plan, kind of essentially establishing the baseline for everything to tie to. A second scanner, which was on a elevated tripod on a dolly, so wheels, so we could push that through the building and elevate it directly in the middle, or say kind of even with the ceiling tiles, pop a ceiling tile and get it halfway up in there. And then a third scanner, which we actually have just a custom-made board, which we've mounted the scanner to, which you can basically plug up into the ceiling and then lay on the ceiling tiles. So that way you can get kind of a double set of scans at the same time. So one that's kind of halfway up in the tiles and the other one that's fully up in there. And that way it just provides a quicker way to move around the building, 3 scanners going at once in every room at different levels. So you don't have to keep going up and down with the same scanner. So highly efficient way to do it if you have the resources to throw extra scanners at it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. Thank you guys so much for being on and sharing your knowledge and experience. Thank you to all of our attendees for sticking in and listening. If there's any questions we didn't get to or any questions that come up afterwards, please feel free to reach out to us at ClearEdge 3D, and we'd be happy to answer your questions, put you in touch with the panelists, etc. Thank you so much. And panelists, you want to say bye?
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you, everybody.
Appreciate it.
All right. Adios.